I just wanted to again acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathered here. I'm actually from Gimoy. Does anyone know where that is? Far North Queensland, it's Cairns. But actually Sydney is my home. So I grew up in Western Sydney with these two lovely ladies who I haven't seen for very, very many years. Thank you so much for coming today and being my support crew. I grew up in Western Sydney, so went to school at Mitchell High School, but have had connections with the Northern Beaches over my many years in Sydney, and I'm actually staying down the road at Seaforth while I'm here. So I'm very honoured that you chose this to do on a Sunday and coming out here to have a chat and a listen. The greatest thrill about this book being out is that I can get out and talk about it now. It's a very long process, so if you're interested, I will talk to you a little bit about the process of writing a book and bringing it to life as well. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. You already know I grew up in Western Sydney, and I actually always wanted to be a journalist ever since I was 9 years old. So my grandfather, who passed away when I was 10, told me at 9 that I reminded him of Jan Wendt. You probably know, many of you in the room will know who that is. And she was 60 Minutes presenter and then a current affair, but one of Australia's leading female journalists. And it really planted the seed for me. I thought, ooh, that sounds good. I love writing. I love telling stories. I love people. So it really set me on the path from that young age, telling stories. So everything I did after that was geared towards becoming a journalist. And my goal was to become an ABC journalist. I saw that as the pinnacle of journalism in Australia. So I set about working towards that, and that's how I ended up with a 15-year career at the ABC. It was a lot of hard work in itself. So I got into university, into a course that required me to be in the top 4% in New South Wales, but I only went for 3 days because at the same time I was going for newspaper cadetships. I just really wanted to get my teeth in and start my journalism career, and I was lucky enough to get a cadetship on my local newspaper at the time, the Blacktown Guardian, which no longer exists. And as the only person with a car on the journalism staff, I was also the photographer. So I've always had this visual element to my role as a journalist as well, which I've loved. So that is how I started my journalism career, right in my backyard. After my cadetship, I took a bit of a sideways step and I worked in the ministerial office of John Aquilina, who was the education minister in the Carr government. Again, many of you may remember back that far, it's quite a long time ago, but I balanced my career between journalism and communication. So I learned a lot in the 3 years that I was working for the minister and then the education department. But I felt like I really needed to get back to my studies in order to get into the ABC. It's very, very competitive. So at that point, I had done so much work experience in my local newspaper and in the ministerial office, and also by then I was starting to do some voluntary work on the weekends for Channel 9 to get some TV experience, and North FM, which I think is called something different these days, but your community radio station on the North Shore, to give myself the best chance. So I was able to do a master's degree at Wollongong University in journalism, and that's what really made the difference getting into the ABC. But I had to go all the way to the middle of Australia to do that. So I had to leave my family behind, and I went to a place where I didn't know anybody. But it was probably the best thing that I ever did, going to Alice Springs. And like many regional places and small places, you become very resourceful, you become very resilient, and you get to do all of the things. So it was probably the best grounding I could have asked for with joining the ABC, because I was able to, again, do everything. I started as a radio journalist, but pretty soon the internet was just starting to be a thing, so we had to write for online, and then they said, no, we need everyone to be bi-media journalists. So I had to then do TV stories as well. And being a place like Alice Springs, it still is in the news all the time, a lot of the time for the wrong reasons, but it was so rich with stories. I actually got to have a lot of national coverage as a reporter there in my first couple of years of journalism. So that was a really, really good grounding for me. And then I went away back to Sydney for a while, worked in ABC News and Current Affairs, so AM, PM, The World Today. And then I decided I was getting itchy feet, so I went over to London for a couple of years. And I can tell you what, that's pretty grounding. I don't know if any of you have done that, but I went from being at the top of my career to being a nobody and having no money and having to do secretarial work while I tried to get something in my own industry. So it was very, very humbling. And I tell you what, it made me appreciate Australia a hell of a lot more, because I had to have 2 jobs the whole time I was there, and one of them was at an Indian restaurant as a maitre d'. It was a very nice Indian restaurant. It was in Chelsea, and we had a lot of celebrities come through the door. Salman Rushdie, Rowan Atkinson, Bryan Adams, whose concert was the first one I ever went to way back when, and that was the first time I met anyone from Nepal. And it kind of started a little bit of a theme in my life. I was actually talking at my old school a couple of days ago, Mitchell High School, and in trawling through my memories from that time, I remembered that when we were senior students, we actually had someone come and give us a presentation, and it was Tim McCartney Snape. And I don't know if any of you remember him, but he is the only person to have walked from the sea to the summit. And he wrote a book about it, and he was part of the first expedition of Australians that went to the summit of Everest. And he came and gave us an inspirational talk. And it really obviously planted a seed for something else that was going to happen in my life. And so did working in an Indian restaurant with lots of Nepalis. This book has been made possible through a Regional Arts Development Fund grant through the Cairns Regional Council, which supports the local arts scene. This was really the way that I was able to take an idea and a desire to do something to actually give me the impetus to start, because essentially I had to leave the workforce to be able to have the time and the focus to be able to produce Himalayan Dreams. So I would like to acknowledge the Cairns Regional Council and the Queensland Government for that. And I would also like to acknowledge Elizabeth McLean. Up until about 8 months ago, we didn't know each other. And she came across an article on the ABC that Som Tamang, my biography subject, and I gave with the ABC about 1.5 years ago about this book, which was not yet published. And she reached out to me, she found me, and she said, how can I get this book? I really need to read it. And I said, well, you can't, because it's not published. I tried for 2 whole years. I wrote to 30 publishers here and overseas trying to get this book published, knowing the value of it, knowing that readers would connect with it and the power of his story. But because he was unknown, they all said no. They said, great story, really well written, but no thank you. We can't make enough money. So Elizabeth comes out of the woodwork, says she wants to read it so much that she actually sent me a cheque in the mail, a complete stranger, to publish the book. So I've been lucky twice in my life, and the reason this book exists is through the support of the Cairns Regional Council, but also Elizabeth, who saw the vision that I had to get this story out. So how did I go from being a journalist to writing a book, you might ask? You might think it's a natural thing to do, but having spent my whole career writing mainly radio news stories and punching out 15 or 20 of those a day, different subjects, quite intense, lots of deadlines, but also lots of instant gratification. because I can just go, oh, yep, I've done that, it's gone to air, I've done that, it's gone to air. So at the end of every day, I had all this work to show for myself. Not with a book. It's a long haul, and there's a lot of self-doubt along the way. It's like, wow, can I actually write something that's 60,000 words? Can I sustain an audience for this amount of time? I knew I could write, but I didn't know I could write a book. So it wasn't as easy as you might think to make that transition from being a journalist to being a writer. And that's what the RADF program is about. It's about trying to develop arts practitioners. And I was able to argue that I needed the support to become and learn how to be a writer. So it's a lonely process. I don't know if anyone in the room has written a book, but yeah, it's a lonely, scary process. First step was, and I should take you back, and we'll eventually get to the slides where I can take you through the story, but you might wonder how I came to write this particular book. So I'm at the ABC at far north Queensland by now. I went back from London to Alice Springs, not just because I loved the place, but also because I fell in love with someone there before I left, and he was good enough to wait for me. We've been married now it'll be 21 years in October. So he's a keeper. This is the day that I met Som. So I was working for ABC Far North. I'd gone to the Cairns newsroom to be the bureau chief there, and the earthquake happened. Som lived in Cairns. He does live in Cairns now, and this amazingly tragic event happened on Anzac Day in 2015. The Nepal earthquake claimed 9,000 lives, and one of them was Som's brother. So I didn't know anything about Som or his charity work at that point, but reached out as a local who had lost family and lost everything he'd worked for, essentially, through Friends of Himalayan Children, a children's hostel. The school was reduced to rubble, and thankfully none of the children were killed, but he did lose his brother, who was instrumental with his work over there at the time. So he invites me into his house, we do an interview, and he's mounting a rescue mission back to Nepal with lots of money and supplies, knowing that in remote places like his village, Batasi, the government wouldn't be getting there, and even the aid organisations may not get there for some time, and there was a real risk of people being dying of exposure or from their injuries or lack of water, lack of food. So he took a volunteer with him and had a quick kind of fundraising campaign, and off he went. So I became really interested in continuing to follow his story, went back several times that year, and he was calling for volunteers. So having covered lots of natural disasters myself, I realised that the need is immediate, but it's also long after. And unfortunately, many other things happen, and our attention gets diverted from the need. So I thought the best time for me to go and help was at least a year after the disaster. And I had my own personal disaster, I suppose. Years and years of covering traumatic events at the ABC eventually caught up with me. And it wasn't actually until a couple of years later that I got diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. But at the time I went to Nepal, I had actually taken a break from the ABC because I couldn't function anymore. I was just a bit of a mess. So I took some time out, and then when I felt strong enough again, I decided to go and volunteer in Batasi village for a month. And that really changed my life, and that was really what cemented getting the book done. So this is Som as a 5-year-old on his first day of school. And this is his sister Fulmaya. And if it wasn't for his intervention, arguing with his parents, fighting against the cultural norm, she would never have got to go to school. But he threatened to leave and not support the family anymore if she couldn't go to school. I'm skipping a whole lot, and perhaps I should read a little bit from the book so you get a sense of what I'm talking about. But Som was a child slave. In pursuit of his own education, his school only went to grade 5, He followed a village uncle to Kathmandu on the promise of being placed with a family that would look after him, that would send him to a good school. Instead, he ended up working for them 24/7, never getting to go to school. So he didn't want that to happen to anyone in his village. So that was really the driver for him to want to protect his younger sister. His older sister had married early, been in a violent relationship, and was having a life which most girls have in the villages over there, which is one of farming and childbearing. So he wanted something different for Fulmaya. And this is him. This is Fulmaya as she was. She finally got to go to school at year 11. And this is Fulmaya a few years ago. One of Som's leading Himalayan trekking guides. She's a qualified pharmacist. She's a qualified social worker. And she now also lives in Australia. So you can see the difference that education can make to a human being and someone believing in you. So I'm just going to read you a little bit from Som's time in slavery. Som's day began at 5 a.m. He had no time to think about his own needs or occupy himself with the usual pursuits of children. His new family kept a close and suspicious eye on him as he passed each day doing chores, preparing meals and following their requests. Weeks and months went by and Som's dream of becoming educated faded. I felt locked up, like there was no world to go out in. That's it. There was no end. It was the longest time of my life. It just felt like it was never ending. I was pretty sad. Som spent the rare moments he had to himself crying. Alone and feeling less valued than an animal, it was the only thing he could do to console himself. While his own family couldn't provide him with much in the way of possessions or education, love was never in short supply. He'd only been surrounded by kindness, generosity, and guidance. But in Kathmandu, trapped in this home full of strangers who used him, Som came to know cruelty. There was no hope at all while I was there. I was angry. But if I acted how I felt, they would probably have hung me from the fan and killed me and dumped me down the river. That's a fear you held when you're in those houses, so you just have to be a good boy. That was the end of my hope of school in Kathmandu and being educated. I never received payment for the work I did. My payment was supposed to be going to school. I couldn't even just go to the shop to pick up bread or something in freedom, as I was always questioned. Why are you so late? Now I realise those events all occurred for their security against me finding out more and learning different things. They feared losing me, so they just controlled everything as much as they could. So that was his experience as a 10-year-old. Can you imagine yourself as a 10-year-old living in that kind of situation? So he wanted more, not just for himself, but he wanted more for the other children in his village. And that's when he started investing in them. So he tried to resume his education, didn't have a lot of success with that, so he became a labourer and eventually went back to Kathmandu. And he could see other Nepalis in Tamil, the tourist district, walking around and actually getting business from foreigners. And he had had an early experience with foreigners in his village. I don't know, has anyone been to Nepal? I know there's a few, it looks like we have a few Nepalis or Bhutanese in the house, but does anyone know where Batasi is? It's in the Sindh-Palchuk region and it's northeast of Kathmandu. So it's about 40 k's if you drive, but I don't recommend it because the road is horrendous and sometimes not there. I found it much safer to actually walk for 2 days to get there, which is about 27 k's worth of walking, and beautiful, beautiful country, but it's quite high up. Batasi's at about an altitude of 1,800 metres above sea level. So where was I? I was just about to tell you another story from the book. That's right. He was seeing all of these tourists and they were going on treks. So he thought, I want a piece of that. I've been lugging around bricks and really, I'm really, really strong from my time in the village and also in construction. So I feel like carrying those bags would be easy, and he had met foreigners early in his life in the village, and it was through another tragedy. He'd actually had an injury that nearly killed him. So I'm just going to read a little bit from that part of the book. Okay. So even as a youngster, Som always needed to find a way to occupy himself. He was not one to sit around idly passing the hours. It was as though he knew there was always work to do to make the situation better. He was not just restless during the day. At night, his family regularly found him wandering near the animal shed or on the paths leading away from his home. But Som wasn't conscious of where his legs were taking him. He was sleepwalking. One night, when he was 7 years old, Som's nocturnal wanderings almost had fatal consequences. He'd been put to bed on the second floor of the family's cottage, but while they slept, Som got up and began to move around, eyes closed, oblivious to any danger. He missed the ladder to the floor below and plummeted several metres, landing on a sharp object with a sickening thud. Som lay on the ground unconscious. When he finally stirred, he found himself surrounded by blood on the dirt floor in the silent house. He was terrified. I knew I'd badly injured my head. My parents were in the middle of a deep sleep. At first, they could not hear me calling because they were tired from working hard on the farm. What felt like 20 minutes later, they woke up and found me. My mum almost lost her mind because she saw blood all over the floor. She started crying and worrying. Som's father, Man Badur, picked him up off the ground and groggily started looking around the home for something to stop the heavy bleeding. His son survived the long, intense night, and as dawn broke, he ventured into the forest with Som's grandfather, the village witch doctor, to find medicinal herbs that they crushed and applied to Som's head wound. Batassi had no medical facilities and limited means of keeping the gaping wound clean. Som's grandfather continued to apply the herbal tincture day after day for a couple of months and conducted healing ceremonies, chanting mantras and praying to the gods to save his eldest grandson, but the wound didn't heal. Family members gathered together to discuss what to do about Som's injury. Even if they did make it to the nearest clinic in Melamchi several hours away, his family feared they may not be able to communicate what happened. Som's family spoke Tamang, and no one could speak the Nepali language fluently. The situation was reversed at the medical centre in the nearest city, where they couldn't easily understand Som's village dialect. Som's auntie could speak a little Nepali and wanted to save Som's life, so she carried her nephew for 6 hours down the steep rocky mountain paths to the closest clinic. When they arrived, the nurse took one look at Som's crushed and bloodied skull and said, "I can't help you here. You'll have to go to the big city to get proper treatment." They couldn't afford such a trip, and even if they had the money, they didn't know how to get to the hospital in Kathmandu, as no one had ever been there. So they made the long, agonising journey, climbing back up the mountain, filled with sadness. Som and his auntie arrived in Batassi late in the dark night with a sense of defeat. His future was uncertain. A year went by, and Som's head was still bleeding and badly infected. The wound was worsening. It was getting bigger, and Som was losing his hair and scalp. Many people told Som's family he would die because they thought he'd lost some of his brain through the wound. Salvation came when hope of a remedy for Som's wounded head was almost gone. Foreign trekkers had lost their way and walked straight into Som's family garden. It felt somehow that they had arrived there just for Som. They asked Ursani, his mother, for directions to the next village, and she gave them. She pleaded with the unexpected visitors to help her son. While she spoke in Tamang and her words were not understood, her meaning was clear. She showed the visitors Som's wounded head, and they looked horrified at the state of it. One of the women had a first aid kit and treated Som's wound, cleaning the site and giving him Western medications. Ursani was afraid she wouldn't be able to afford the care that had been administered, but instead of asking for payment, the foreigners gave Som money. He was confused but gratefully accepted it and sent the travellers on their way in the right direction. He couldn't take the smile off his face. His heart was full of happiness and finally the hope of healing and surviving. I recovered 1 or 2 months after their treatment. I was about 8 or 9 years of age by then. From that experience, I learned a lot in my life, like there are very kind people on the earth, so be kind to them. I'm kind to others as much as I can be, and I will always help and support others in need. Since that day, I became fascinated by foreigners. They'd made a big impression on me. I started to find out how I could meet foreigners and help them and get to know them. So it's in this context that Som comes to Mel, sees the foreigners and decides he wants to be a trekking guide. So he's able to do that. He's very, very charming and persuasive, and he does that along the way. So that gives him the means to be able to start supporting Fulmaya and his other younger brothers and his cousins to go to school. So how did I end up there? I've told you a little bit about that. So I wanted to help after the earthquake happened. And before that happened, I was asked to MC the first International Women's Day event that they had to fundraise. So a lot of the focus of SOM's work is really about girls and giving them equal opportunities in Nepal. So I started sponsoring Janisha. She was 6 years old at the time. My husband sent me off to this fundraising event saying, I want us to sponsor somebody, make sure it's the youngest girl possible. So Janisha was the youngest. She's 6. She's now 14. And in October this year, my husband will finally get to meet her. He's finally coming to Nepal with me. When I went in 2016, I then started sponsoring Rabina. I came back from that trip, again, having volunteered for a month teaching in the school. And my husband said, okay, I know there'll be somebody else. Who are we going to sponsor now? So that's Rabina. And she has now just started grade 12 in Kathmandu. And then our Women in Media contingent sponsored Som Tamang, who was the only person of all the students that I interviewed asking what help they needed, that said that she wanted to be a journalist, and she was able to study journalism. Back to the earthquake. This is probably the reference that if you haven't been to Nepal, you would probably know about. And this is really how this started, because it was the earthquake that put me in touch with SOM, that led to me volunteering, that being immersed in that community for a month, really, I came home with that going, I have to write this story. It's an amazing, incredible story that somebody, as you've heard, has overcome so much in his life and has now been able to help hundreds of children in his village actually access an education. This is Samjana Tamang. She came to get me with Fulmaya, Som's sister, the first time I came to Batasi. So she met me on the outskirts of Kathmandu, and we all walked together for the 2 days to get to Batasi. And she is now, she was 19 at the time, and this was her first kind of practice trek that she did picking me up. And she is now one of SOM's lead guides, and the first to actually get married and then go back to trekking. Normally when women get married in Nepal, that's it. They've changed their focus, they are having children, they are looking after their husband's parents, and they're not really pursuing careers. But Samjana has broken the mould by getting married and going back into trekking. Oh, here we go.
To help his home country recover from a devastating earthquake. The magnitude 7.8 quake hit Nepal in April 2015, killing almost 9,000 people. Many of the ruined villages are still waiting for government help. But one remote community is getting back on its feet through running.
Almost 2 years on, the scars are still visible. The powerful earthquake left 3.5 million people homeless.
No one who lost their houses, who lost everything, no one has started to build up proper permanent houses yet. They will be still in the sheds maybe many more years.
Han's resident, Som Tamang, lost his brother in the quake. He returned to his family's village of Batasi to find his charity's children's hostel reduced to rubble. To help deal with the tragedy, he turned to running.
Running has been like a medicine for me. It's only since earthquake that I started running long distance and really take it seriously.
Others in Som Tamang's village are now following his lead, particularly young women.
First, I want to be a champion runner. After that, I want to be in the Nepalese army.
20-year-old Samjana is new to running, but is already placing well in long-distance races. The chance to compete has opened new opportunities beyond child marriage and a life of domestic service.
For the women and girls working as housekeepers in Kathmandu, I want to make them strong like me, to inspire them.
The villagers have been training hard for this week's Ultra Trail event
That's
organised by
Fulmaya.
Som Tamang's charity. It's more than just a race.
All the funds come from Ultra Trail Nepal event we'll be using to build infrastructure for drinking water in the villages on the trails of Ultra Trail.
The need is still great. The Australian government will spend an estimated $34 million on aid to Nepal this financial year. But Batasi village is solely reliant on donations to meet the needs of the orphan children continuing to arrive.
The future of this village will be, I think, very bright. because all the peoples are very hard worker. They have a positive thought. They have a unity. They have a strength.
And they have a race to win. Kirsty Nancarrow, ABC News, Batasi Village, Nepal.
And they did. One of the girls actually from the village won one of the race categories, and you'll read about that in the book, Sangeeta, and the prize money was able to sustain her family for a very long time. So it wasn't just about winning a race, it was actually about creating a means for the community to support each other. So I've decided I want to write this story. How do I go about it? I thought, well, I have to go back. I have to go and interview Som's family members. I have to go and speak to people at the school. I have to go and speak to some of the young men and women who have been helped by Friends of Himalayan Children and paint a picture, because Som's not very forthcoming. He's a very humble man, and I interviewed him many, many times, and he'd give me tiny little bits of information. And it wasn't until I started interviewing lots of different people in his life, from his Friends of Himalayan Children committee members to people he went to university with, to his partner Susan, that I started getting a bigger picture of Som. And then I was able to go back to him and actually say, so tell me about this time, like the head injury. He'd never really mentioned it. And I said, can you please tell me about that? There was also a tiger attack, which he hadn't mentioned. And for me, all of these things were quite noteworthy, but I had to sort of tease it out through interviewing other people and then going back to Som and saying, tell me a little bit about this. So I knew I had to go back to Nepal, and I had an opportunity 2 years after my visit, and I didn't realise at the time, I had no ambition to walk to Everest Base Camp, but that was my opportunity, because Som and his partner Susan put together a women-only trek to Everest Base Camp, and I thought, well, that's how I get to spend time with him and immerse myself in his world. And so that's what I did. We raised money to build the first library in Batasi, and I got to spend more time with Som and some of the women that he helped and do some interviews. So that's us at Facting on the way back from Everest Base Camp. So I met some really interesting characters along the way of writing this book. People I didn't know were part of his story until I started my writing journey. So I don't know if you've come across Jason Clarke before, but he actually played Rob Hall, the New Zealand expedition leader in Everest, the movie. And Jason Clarke actually gave Som a reference when he met Jason and helped him explore Kathmandu when he was over there for an acting job. And Som asked Jason if he'd write him a reference because he wanted to come to Australia. And he did. And it was such a joy to try and track down Jason Clarke and actually tell him that Som actually had been living in Australia for 20 years and that reference had made a difference. So that was pretty cool. So he was introduced to Jason by the next man, Malcolm Kennard, who is also an Australian actor, and I'm hoping that he is coming to our book launch today. I'm not sure if he will, but I haven't actually seen him face to face, but he's living here in Sydney, and he was really helpful in helping me piece together a story about Som's character. I don't want to give too much away, but there's lots of adventure and shenanigans in the book, and Som essentially goes to Everest Base Camp for the very first time with Malcolm. He convinces Malcolm that he's a seasoned trekking guide and he's up to the job, and then when they fly into Lukla, he reveals that he hasn't ever actually been there before, but that it's all going to be fine. And as you'll read in the book, it wasn't fine, but they both got out alive. And then, of course, Conrad Anker, mountaineer, famous mountaineer, he's been involved with some of the girls that have been developed through Som's trekking business Take on Nepal, and giving them extra training in ice climbing and becoming seasoned guides. And then Julius Dreyer is one of the first people that Som took to his village. Just picked him up in town as a scruffy looking German backpacker. Didn't realise until he'd taken him to his village that actually this man was an internet millionaire. and was very invested after visiting Batassi in helping him. So he was the one that provided the first real money to help Som start developing the school and the hostel. So all of these characters are in the book, so it's not just Som's story. I had my own challenges along the way. So finally in 2020, I've got all the interviews. I've been to Nepal a couple of times. I've got a grant. I'm ready to start. But then I had some health issues as well, and I ended up going and having a hysterectomy. And I thought, great, I'll have a few weeks off work. By this time I'd started my own business, and I thought I'll just spend my time recovering and writing the book. But of course you don't feel like doing anything, so it was a little bit of a setback. So here's me writing bits of the story in the hairdressers, because I'm just trying to be on a deadline. So even though I had a year to write the book, to acquit the grant, I was still leaving it to the last minute and racing to the finish line. And we finally made it. I finished writing the book towards the end of 2021, and as I said, spent 2 years after that trying to convince publishers to take the book on. But thanks to the generosity of Elizabeth McLean, we were finally able to turn this amazing story into an actual book. Som has a fair trade store called Himalayan Dreams in Cairns, so that's Som and I having pulled the book out of the box for the first time when it's an actual thing. So very proud moment for us. And then earlier this year, we had the pleasure of launching the book, inviting Elizabeth to, my time must be up, inviting Elizabeth to the book launch. We got to meet her for the first time and honour her support of this project. So this is on that Everest Base Camp trip, and these girls were his trekking guides, and I was so proud because 2 years before that they were in my classroom as students, and now they're young leaders. I'm getting goosebumps even though it's cold or I'm warm in here. I'm getting goosebumps because it's so amazing to see the transformation in these young women and the opportunities that they've taken and run with. This is the school today, so as you can see it has been rebuilt thanks to Caritas, but we're on a mission with this book to try and raise enough money to take the school to grade 12. At the moment kids either drop out after year 10 or they have to go to a school several hours away, and that costs a lot of money, so many of them don't actually have that opportunity. So there is a companion project through Rotary International where we're trying to raise money for that. But I would love to open it up to questions now to see if you have anything that this has brought up for you. Thank you very much, everyone.
I just wonder, how did he get to Australia?
You'll have to read the book.
I mean, it's not easy then, if he's been in Australia 20 years, I would have thought.
No, I'll give a little bit away. It was a woman involved.
Okay.
Yeah, woman and trekking.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, so ended up studying English here and was able to stay. Yeah, so he finally did finish his degree, his high school at TAFE, and was able to be the first person from his village to earn a degree from James Cook University. Come on, there must be some more questions.
Are you planning to write another book?
No, I think my husband and my business partner might have something to say about that. I loved it. It was one of the hardest things, but one of the most rewarding things that I've ever done. I think maybe when I'm retired, I will entertain the idea, but I actually run a company called Emotion Video Training and Production now, and I've had to balance the book and the business for a few years now. So I'm actually, once my little book tour is complete, which may be not for another year because I want to try and get to writers' festivals, I'll be concentrating on the business. So never say never, but not immediately.
Are they growing rice on those terraces?
Yes, so they grow rice, they grow millet, and if you were to head on to the Friends of Himalayan Children social media channels at the moment, I think I saw a video overnight. It's monsoon season there, so they're all out there planting at the moment, and it's muddy and they're having mud fights and growing the next season's crop. So I did get to harvest rice while I was over there, and it's really nice to be part of the community, and they're all working to feed everyone in the community. So whether you're a kid going to school or whether you are, in the last few years of your life, this is the sort of activity that you're involved in, just to keep things going.
When you did the 2 days trek,
Yes.
but this may sound very basic, but where did you sleep? Or
So on the way to the village, we stayed at a hotel called Dorje Lakpa, which is one of the mountains, which it overlooks. And it used to be 3 or 4 stories, but since the earthquake, it's just the one. But they assured me it was safe. So in a place called Chisapani, it was actually higher than Batasi. So by the time we got there, I was actually feeling the altitude a little bit. So if you are going to go trekking over there, go and see your GP about maybe getting some altitude medication. And then Batasi is a little bit lower, about 300 or 400 metres lower than that. So yes, there are places to stay, and if you're doing the base camp trek or Annapurna trek or any of those other treks, there's tea houses along the way, and that provides income and employment for the village communities in Nepal.